Hello students. So today we are in chapter 5 looking at consumer and producer surplus. We'll then use that to make an analysis of taxation. We learned about consumer surplus in the previous episode. Its complement is producer surplus. So the producer has a willingness to accept. That is the lowest price they'd be willing to take when they're selling a good. Your book calls it willingness to sell, but that term is not as common. Most books will say willingness to accept. This is analogous to the consumer's willingness to pay. So he said the consumer had a maximum willingness to pay for a good, a price that they would not be willing to pay anything higher than. This is just the other side of it for the producer. Now, typically when a producer sells a good, they often sell at a price that is higher than their bare minimum. It's just like how a consumer often pays less than their maximum willingness to pay. So when there's a gap between the price that the seller would accept and the price they actually get, we call that gap the producer surplus. It's a measure of how much better off the producer is as a result of the trade. Now, to be clear, producer surplus is not quite the same thing as profit. I think we'll talk more about that later on in one of the future chapters. It is, however, closely related to profit. So, this is an example from the book of Genesis. So, Jacob was making some stew, and Jacob's brother Esau was so hungry he thought that I gotta have some stew to eat or have something to eat, or I'm not gonna live. Jacob, though, realized that he was in a very strong position here. There is no other food available except for Jacob's stew, so Esau was willing to give up pretty much anything to get the stew. So Jacob charged him a really high price. Just to put a number on it, I said $10,000. In the actual story, Esau sells his birthright. Let's say that Jacob only valued the stew at $15. Pretty much just another bowl of stew he's making. But he gets this huge payment from Esau because he knows Esau is desperate and he's exploiting that. So Jacob's producer surplus is 10,000 minus 15. That works out to 9,985. So if you have a monopoly and your consumers are absolutely desperate, you can get away with a lot of stuff. We'll talk more about monopolies later on. Now, just as the demand curve approximated the consumer's willingness to pay, so also does the supply curve approximate the seller's willingness to accept. So you could draw a table like we had earlier, and then you get this staircase supply curve, kind of like we had in the previous episode for demand. As you add more and more suppliers and more goods, that staircase starts to look like a straight line. I'll just remind you of what that earlier slide looked like in the previous chapter. So that was back over here. So you gradually start looking more and more like a straight line. Same thing's true for supply. Now you could also do a nonlinear supply curve, just as you could have a nonlinear demand curve. We're typically not going to talk about those cases because that requires some calculus, and that's not a prereq for this class. So mostly concern yourselves with this case. So the idea is that the supplier is willing to accept a price as low as this, the one given by the supply curve here in blue. The price they actually get in the marketplace is this black line price. Therefore, the gap between what they're willing to accept and what they actually get is this triangle. So for this good, for example, we'd be willing to accept the price as low as this much, where you see my mouse on the graph. the price you get in the market is that much. Our producer surplus for that good is this distance. The producer surplus for this good over here is going to be that distance, and then you have a distance over here for this good. Add all that together, get this triangle. So that's producer surplus. If you add it together with consumer surplus, you get what's called total surplus. So we said in the previous episode, consumer surplus is the area below demand and above the price. That'd be up over here. Producer surplus is the area above supply and below price. That's over here. So this big triangle with all that is total surplus. P star here is the market price. Now you might notice that at price P star, consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized. That's a way in which the market can be said to be efficient. There are some other definitions of efficiency as well, and we talk a bit more about that in some of the more advanced classes. Now, to be clear, though, economics is not solely about efficiency. Recall back in Chapter 2, we talked about positive statements, about facts. So things like efficiency would be in the realm of the positive. There's also normative statements, which is about our opinions and values. So there's also some scope to discuss equity and fairness. So there's a lot more. We talk about that in one of my other classes, public econ. That is Econ 445. The problem with talking about fairness, though, is that oftentimes it's influenced by our own self-interest, so it can be kind of difficult to disentangle that from what is more reasonably considered fair. So I claim that the market outcome is efficient in this sense, that it maximizes total surplus. If I were to try any other price other than this market price, total surplus goes down. So let's verify that. So here is a price P prime. P prime is above the market price. Market price would be somewhere down here where supply and demand meet. So producers are getting a higher price, which would make their producer surplus area taller. The trouble they face, though, is that consumers are going to buy less when prices go up. So consumer surplus shrinks, and now it's going to be this small triangle over here. So some of the consumer surplus got transferred to producers. However, some of this area is now not part of anybody's surplus. This triangle I have over here in between. So that triangle was previously split up between consumers and producers, but now no one gets it because those trades don't happen anymore. When the price goes up, consumers start buying less, so these units are not being bought and sold anymore. So some of it's producers benefiting at consumers' expense, but another part of it is just consumer and producer surplus just being lost because of some transactions not happening. So try to charge a price above the market price would reduce total surplus. That's inefficient. If you try to help out consumers by charging a price below the market price, that's also inefficient. So consumers get a taller area here because they're paying a lower price than they would in the market. Market price would be over here. However, the drawback is that producers start producing less when prices go down. Some of those extra units of production are no longer worthwhile for them to produce. So consumers don't get the benefits of these last units over here. Producer surplus also gets squeezed. this triangle over here in the middle is now not part of anyone's surplus because some trades are not taking place. Those trades over here in this triangle would benefit both sides. So for a point right around here where my mouse is, consumers are more than willing to pay that price. Suppliers would accept a price below that. So these units here could benefit everybody. But it's not happening because the price here is below the market price. That's cutting into total surplus and harming overall welfare. Some books and articles will call social welfare this total surplus. So total surplus and social welfare are sometimes, but not always, used interchangeably. Some books, though, reserve a special meaning for social welfare that is distinct from total surplus. It does, however, measure society's overall well-being. So that's our section on producer surplus and social welfare and total surplus. And we also mentioned that equitability is a concern as well. So that wraps up our episode in this section of Chapter 5. Be sure to tune in for our next episode in which we look at taxes on demand.